The macabre history of the Fairfax family, a sinister tale in the dying breath of autumn in 1848, as iron tools bit into rotting wood and dust rose like disturbed ash. The abandoned halls of St. Mary's Academy for Young Ladies finally began to surrender their secrets. The building had stood silent for decades, watching Salem harbor with empty windows, enduring storms, gossip, and deliberate forgetting. When workers tore up the chapel floorboards, they expected rats, mold, maybe the bones of forgotten repairs. Instead, they uncovered a lead-lined box hidden, as if the earth itself had been sworn to secrecy. Inside were 47 small leather journals, each one marked with a different girl's name, written in careful, disciplined script that trembled only where the truth became unbearable. What those pages described was not education, nor charity, nor salvation. They were confessions etched in fear, records of suffering disguised as moral correction. Yet even that was not what froze the blood of those who read them in locked rooms, under oath, by candlelight. Tucked among the entries were precise ledgers, immaculate and unemotional, listing visitors, donations, private meetings. The names belonged to men whose portraits hung in state houses and universities, men spoken of with reverence at dinner tables across New England. Within days, the Commonwealth sealed everything. Public safety, they claimed. National stability. And the truth was buried once more, locked behind stone walls and legal silence. What I am about to tell you does not come from those sealed pages alone. It comes from whispered testimonies, letters that vanished from family estates, and the final confession of a woman who carried this knowledge like a curse for 60 years, waiting until death loosened the grip of fear. If you have ever felt drawn to the darker undercurrents of history, if you believe virtue can be a mask and respectability a weapon, then listen closely. What unfolded at St. Mary's Academy will dismantle every comforting illusion about innocence and power in 19th century New England. This is Gospel of the Haunted, and once you step inside this story, the shadows will remember you. To understand the rot, we must return to Salem in 1811. The town still trembled beneath the long shadow of its witch trial past, desperate to prove it had evolved beyond hysteria and cruelty. Its elite spoke endlessly of progress, piety, and enlightenment, polishing their reputations with institutions and sermons. It was nearer obsessed with moral restoration, and into that hunger stepped the Fairfax family, offering redemption wrapped in refinement. Victoria Fairfax arrived like an answer to prayer. She was tall, composed, her steel-gray eyes unsettling in their intensity, as if they measured souls rather than faces. Born to wealth in Virginia, educated among philosophers and reformers, she had seen the world beyond Salem's narrow streets. Widowed young after her husband's death in a southern fever epidemic, she carried both fortune and fervor northward, declaring her life's purpose to be the elevation of young womanhood. Her proposal to establish an academy devoted to faith, discipline, and learning was met with admiration bordering on awe. St. Mary's Academy promised opportunity for the forgotten and refinement for the privileged. Orphans would be educated freely. Daughters of respectable families would be shaped into paragons of virtue. Lessons would include language, music, proper conduct, and unwavering Protestant morality. Salem's leaders praised the vision from pulpits and parlors alike, relieved to see their city associated with purity instead of persecution. The building Victoria chose was already soaked in unease. The Georgian mansion on Beacon Hill had been abandoned since its original owner's death, its corridors echoing with rumors of cold drafts, phantom footsteps, and an oppressive presence that crushed the breath from visitors' lungs. Families had fled it in the night, leaving furniture behind, claiming the house did not want to be inhabited. Victoria dismissed such talk as weakness. She purchased the property cheaply and transformed it with relentless purpose. Renovations reshaped the mansion into an institution. A chapel wing bloomed from the structure, adorned with stained glass saints gazing downward in eternal judgment. Dormitories lined the lower floors, orderly and sparse. The dining hall echoed with hymns and enforced silence. But it was the third floor that drew quiet attention. There Victoria commissioned a series of narrow private chambers, calling them meditation rooms. Places, she said, where girls could confront their sins alone, guided by prayer and reflection. No mirrors were installed, the doors locked from the outside. She did not work alone. Her sister Evangeline joined her, pale and trembling, her hair prematurely grey as if grief had aged her early. Her hands shook when she taught, yet her voice, when raised in song, carried an unnatural beauty that stilled even the harbour winds. Students adored her, clung to her gentleness, unaware of how carefully that softness was curated. Music and language were her domains, and through them she taught obedience disguised as grace. The final pillar of the Fairfax vision was Bartholomew, Victoria's brother-in-law, a man whose presence drained warmth from any room. Tall, hollow-cheeked, his sermons were delivered with absolute certainty, leaving no space for doubt or mercy. He had wandered the southern states for years as a preacher, and when he arrived in Salem, he brought with him an understanding of control that transcended scripture. As chaplain of the academy, he oversaw confession, penance, and what he called spiritual correction. Together, they created a sanctuary that outsiders praised and insiders feared. Girls entered through the front doors seeking salvation, education, or survival. Many never truly left. Some were sent away suddenly, returned to the world broken and silent. Others simply vanished, their absence explained with polished lies and charitable excuses. Decades later, when those journals surfaced beneath the chapel floor, the truth clawed its way back into the light. The Fairfax legacy was not one of moral uplift, but of ritualized suffering, exploitation sanctified by scripture, and silence enforced by power. The house on Beacon Hill had never been cursed by ghosts. It had been waiting, and even now, long after the records were sealed and the names protected, the echoes of St. Mary's Academy continue to whisper through Salem's streets, reminding us that evil does not always announce itself with screams. Sometimes it arrives dressed in virtue, smiling gently and asking for your trust. The injuries, when noticed at all, were dismissed as harmless mishaps, clumsy fingers pricked by needles, careless slips during household chores. Bartholomew's sermons provided the perfect veil. From the pulpit, his voice thundered about the decay of the modern age, about temptation lurking in every corner, about young women as the preferred vessels through which darkness crept into the world. Parents listened in rigid silence, fear tightening their chests, yet relief followed close behind. Their daughters, they believed, were under the watchful eye of a man who could smell sin before it spoke. St. Mary's, they were assured, was safe. When the academy opened its doors that September, the celebration felt almost holy. Banners fluttered, bells rang, and Salem's most powerful figures gathered beneath a sky bruised with early autumn clouds. The mayor stood proudly beside legislators and church authorities, all nodding as Victoria Fairfax addressed the crowd. Her black silk dress caught the wind, leaves spiraling around her feet as she spoke of sanctuary, of refinement, of shielding young souls from a world obsessed with profit and vice. Her words were calm, precise, and utterly convincing. No one noticed how her gaze lingered on the building behind her, not with pride, but with possession. The first girls crossed the threshold believing they had been chosen. Some arrived in fine coats, escorted by families who could afford the steep tuition, eager to boast of their daughters' moral education. Others came alone, clutching small bundles of clothing, stunned by the promise of a bed, regular meals, and letters instead of labor. Among them was Margaret Sullivan, barely 14, her hands already rough from mill work, her spirit still burning bright despite the smoke and hunger of her past. When the Academy's representative spoke to her of education and purpose, it felt like a miracle with her name written on it. Priscilla Morse followed, quiet and sharp-eyed, carrying grief like a second spine. Books had been her only refuge, and the thought of a library filled her with trembling excitement. Then there was Hannah Whitmore, so small and pale she seemed made of fog. When Victoria herself visited the poorhouse and offered her a place, Hannah wept openly, overwhelmed by kindness after months of neglect. Each girl stepped into St. Mary's with gratitude swelling in her chest, unaware that hope was the first thing being harvested. The mansion closed around them like a mouth. Days were rigid, nights heavy with silence. Prayers were constant, confessions mandatory, solitude enforced as discipline. Those third-floor chambers, praised as places of reflection, became spaces the girls learned to dread. Doors shut softly behind them. Time stretched and twisted. When they returned, their eyes were unfocused, their voices thinner, as if pieces of them had been left behind in the dark. The first whisper of unease came from outside. Abigail Thornton, a seamstress whose life depended on careful observation, noticed what others did not. Her deliveries took her past the academy each week, and from the road below Beacon Hill she watched patterns form. On a grey morning she arrived early and saw carriages pulling away from the side entrance, not the grand front steps meant for visitors. The men who emerged did not linger. They kept their faces hidden, movements sharp with urgency, as though daylight itself might accuse them. Once noticed, the pattern refused to disappear. The visits happened at night, always at night, the wheels of expensive carriages crunching softly on gravel. Sometimes one, sometimes many. Mrs. Thornton counted them from her window, heart pounding, recognizing the quality of the vehicles even when insignias were absent. These were not tradesmen or ministers. These were men accustomed to command. The girls began to change. Their laughter vanished. Their shoulders slumped. During deliveries, Mrs. Thornton glimpsed them through lace-curtained windows, moving slowly, mechanically, as if walking through unseen resistance. Bruises bloomed along wrists and arms, hidden hastily when noticed. Cuts on hands were explained away, voices reciting excuses they had clearly been taught. Something in their eyes was missing, replaced by a dull compliance that chilled the seamstress more than any rumor. She tried to speak of it once quietly to another woman in town. The response was swift and sharp. St. Mary's was beyond reproach. Victoria Fairfax was a pillar of virtue. Bartholomew was a man of God. To suggest otherwise was indecent. Mrs. Thornton learned what the girls were learning, though far too late. Silence was enforced not by walls but by belief. Inside the academy, discipline tightened. Confessions grew longer, more invasive. Bartholomew's voice echoed through the chapel, insisting that suffering purified, that obedience was love, that resistance was proof of corruption. Victoria watched everything, recording details in ledgers no student ever saw. Evangeline's hymns softened the edges, wrapping cruelty in beauty, her voice floating through corridors while doors locked upstairs. Some girls tried to run. Their attempts were never spoken of. Beds emptied. Names vanished from attendance lists. Explanations were offered with practiced ease: illness, family emergencies. Transfers arranged quietly for their own good. Letters sent to guardians went unanswered or were never delivered at all. The town accepted these stories because it needed to believe them. Margaret's spark dimmed first. Priscilla stopped asking questions. Hannah learned not to cry. They were not alone. The mansion fed on vulnerability, on gratitude twisted into obligation. The walls listened, the floors remembered. Every whispered prayer was absorbed, every muffled sob pressed into the wood. By the time Mrs. Thornton stopped her deliveries, claiming illness she did not have, the damage was already done. St. Mary's Academy stood immaculate from the outside, a triumph of morality overlooking the harbor. Inside, it was something else entirely. A mechanism, a carefully maintained abyss. And years later, when the floors were finally torn open and the journals exposed, the truth returned with a vengeance. Ink could fade, names could be hidden, records could be sealed, but the suffering had soaked too deeply into the bones of that place to ever be erased. Even now, if you stand at the base of Beacon Hill as night falls, you might feel it, a pressure in the air, a whisper carried on the wind, a reminder that some institutions are built not to protect the innocent, but to consume them quietly, reverently, and without mercy. The change was impossible to miss in Margaret Sullivan. She had once greeted Mrs. Thornton with quick smiles and breathless chatter, eager to share fragments of lessons and small victories, as if knowledge itself were a treasure she could finally hold. By the time winter tightened its grip on Salem, that girl seemed to have vanished. Margaret now moved like a shadow through the halls, her voice reduced to murmurs, her laughter erased. The vivid red of her hair dulled to a lifeless rust clinging to her skull as though drained of warmth, her face thinned, eyes set too deeply, skin stretched pale and fragile. When she dared to look at Mrs. Thornton, her stare carried a silent urgency, a pleading intensity that felt like a message trapped behind locked teeth. Mrs. Thornton would later realize that look had been a warning. The night that shattered her remaining doubts arrived in the depths of December, when the cold pressed so fiercely against her chest that sleep became impossible. A persistent cough drove her from her bed just past midnight. Wrapped in a shawl, she moved quietly through her small kitchen, setting water to boil for tea. It was there, standing beside the window, that she noticed the academy stirring at an hour when it should have been lifeless. Light pulsed in the uppermost windows, not steady or calm, but restless, flickering wildly as if flames were being carried from room to room. At first, she reasoned with herself. A sick child, a late vigil, a careless lamp. But then the sound came. It was faint, muffled by distance and stone, yet unmistakably human. A cry that broke and vanished, then returned again, torn loose by terror or pain. The sound drifted from the direction of the chapel, brief and irregular, as though someone were trying not to scream, failing again and again. Mrs. Thornton felt the blood drain from her limbs. She pressed her face to the cold glass, breath fogging the pain, heart hammering so loudly she feared it might drown out whatever horrors were unfolding beyond her sight. The chapel windows glowed with the same unstable light. Shadows slid across the glass, stretching, bending, colliding in ways that made her stomach twist. The cries continued, separated by long, dreadful silences that felt worse than the sounds themselves. Those quiet stretches suggested restraint, deliberation, control. Nearly an hour passed before the lights dimmed, and the academy returned to its rigid stillness, leaving Mrs. Thornton shaking, convinced she had witnessed something that should never have been allowed to exist. When morning came, she clung desperately to denial. Illness, she told herself, a nightmare born of fever and exhaustion. Reason was the only shield she had left. 3 days later, that shield shattered. When Mrs. Thornton arrived with her next delivery, the academy felt altered, as if the building itself were holding its breath. She was met with solemn faces and lowered eyes. It was then she learned that Hannah Whitmore was dead. The girl had passed during the night, they said, claimed by a sudden fever. Victoria Fairfax delivered the explanation herself, dressed in mourning attire so immaculate it bordered on theatrical. Her voice held no tremor, her expression no visible grief. She spoke of medical efforts and divine will with polished calm, standing taller than ever, as though death had somehow reinforced her authority. The funeral was held the following morning, closed to outsiders. Mrs. Thornton was not invited, but she heard the hymns drifting down Beacon Hill. The voices carried something wrong within them, thin and strained, trembling with fear rather than sorrow. Evangeline. Singing rose above the rest, flawless and haunting, yet even her angelic tone could not conceal the undercurrent of desperation vibrating through the chapel air. Hannah was buried behind the academy beneath a simple stone cross. No family stood by the grave. Victoria noted this absence with a remark so flat it bordered on satisfaction, as though the lack of witnesses simplified matters. After Hannah's death, the academy seemed to sicken. Other girls began to fade in the same way. Their steps slowed, their faces hollowed. When Mrs. Thornton caught glimpses of them, she saw Hannah's final days mirrored again and again. When she cautiously asked after their health, Victoria offered smooth reassurances. The girls, she said, were adjusting. Discipline, study, and moral refinement were demanding processes, particularly for those from unfortunate backgrounds. Some required more time to be shaped properly. Mrs. Thornton listened, nodded, and felt dread coiled tighter in her chest. She began to observe carefully, noting who declined and who did not. A pattern emerged that chilled her to the bone. The worst affected were always the charity students, the girls without parents, without advocates, without the means to leave. The paying students appeared subdued, yes, but they retained color, alertness, and presence. Whatever was happening at St. Mary's, it was selective. Then February arrived, and with it death returned twice in a single week. Priscilla Morse was found lifeless in her bed one morning, her body arranged too neatly, her face eerily calm. 3 days later, Mary Catherine O'Brien convulsed violently before succumbing to what was labeled a fever of the brain. The burials followed the same quiet script. No questions, no delays, no scrutiny. Official reports were filed, but they led nowhere. The Academy's physician conveniently was family, the coroner equally so. Each death was recorded as natural, unfortunate, unavoidable. Victoria Fairfax's reputation only grew stronger, her charitable dedication praised in town gatherings, her name spoken with reverence. Mrs. Thornton stood alone with her knowledge, crushed beneath the weight of it. She was no scholar, no official, just a seamstress with eyes that saw too much. She understood with devastating clarity that truth meant nothing without power to carry it. and so the academy endured. Its doors remained open, its secrets deepened, and the girls who entered continued to disappear into its shadowed corridors, one by one, while Salem looked away, comforted by the lie that evil would never dare wear such a respectable face. The academy continued to welcome visits from ministers, benefactors, and civic figures, each arriving with polite smiles and departing with glowing praise. They spoke of discipline, charity, and moral triumph, blind or unwilling to see what lay beneath the polished surface. Yet for Abigail Thornton, no amount of public admiration could erase the memory burned into her mind. The image of that unnatural light dancing behind chapel windows, the sound of strangled cries dissolving into the winter air. Whatever was happening on Beacon Hill was deliberate, concealed, and protected by reputation. The truth did not surface then. It waited, patient and festering, growing more grotesque with time, until the day it finally emerged and proved far worse than even her most private fears. By the time spring crept reluctantly into Salem, a heavy stillness had settled over St. Mary's Academy, as though the building itself had grown weary of holding secrets. Sound seemed to die within its walls. Footsteps felt muted. Even prayer carried no echo. 3 deaths in mere months should have shattered the institution, yet the routine marched on with chilling precision. Lessons continued. Bells rang. Hymns were sung. Loss was treated as inconvenience, not warning. Victoria Fairfax appeared untouched by sorrow. If anything, adversity seemed to refine her resolve. She spoke often of divine testing, of suffering as evidence of God's attention. Her addresses to the remaining students sharpened in tone, stripping away any lingering softness. From the chapel pulpit, her voice carried authority sharpened to a blade, her pale eyes scanning the rows of bowed heads. She reminded them that they arrived damaged, that poverty, abandonment, and moral weakness had stained their souls. Such corruption, she insisted, could only be cleansed through relentless discipline and total submission. Redemption, she warned, was not guaranteed. Some would falter, some would fail, but those who endured would be rewarded beyond mortal understanding. The implication hung heavy in the air, unspoken yet unmistakable. Survival itself had become conditional. The girls listened without reaction. They had learned that expression was dangerous. Emotion invited scrutiny. Curiosity invited punishment. Those who asked questions were quietly reassigned. Floors scrubbed until hands burned raw. Gardens tended under merciless sun. Hours locked alone in the third-floor chambers, left to confront their sins in suffocating silence. Resistance was not crushed loudly. It was eroded patiently. Margaret Sullivan, now older in body and ancient in spirit, had perfected invisibility. The vibrant girl she once was had been buried beneath routine and restraint. She moved soundlessly, spoke sparingly, and revealed nothing through her eyes, yet beneath that empty mask, her mind remained alert, watching, remembering, calculating. She began to notice patterns no one else dared acknowledge. Certain girls were summoned for what Evangeline Fairfax called special instruction. The phrase itself carried an ominous weight. These sessions always occurred at night. After the academy settled into enforced quiet, the selected students vanished upstairs after supper, returning hours later, long past midnight. When they did, they moved as though detached from their bodies, eyes unfocused, limbs heavy. Margaret recognized that hollow gait. She had seen it before. She had seen it in those who never recovered. She also noticed the timing. The special instruction coincided precisely with the arrival of the unmarked carriages. Margaret learned their schedule through patience and fear. The side entrance opened only at night. It was never used during daylight hours, when visitors were paraded through the main hall and observed carefully. That narrow door led straight to the third floor, bypassing every public space. No oversight, no witnesses. The connection became impossible to ignore. Girls who attended multiple sessions began to deteriorate. Meals went untouched. Complaints of headaches and nausea spread quietly. Hands trembled. Voices weakened. The same subtle shaking that plagued Evangeline's fingers appeared again and again among the chosen students. When concerns were raised, Dr. Edmund Fairfax dismissed them with smooth certainty. He claimed these symptoms reflected heightened spiritual sensitivity. The body, he said, reacted violently when the soul was being purified. Pain was progress. Weakness was transformation. The academy's structure ensured silence. Days began before dawn with mandatory chapel. Breakfast was barely sustenance, followed by relentless hours of instruction. Conversation was restricted. Eye contact discouraged. Evenings were devoted to moral correction, reinforcing obedience until the girls could no longer remember thinking otherwise. Bonds between students were quietly dismantled. Isolation was enforced as virtue. Margaret listened. Margaret watched, and Margaret understood. She realized the academy was not merely a school, it was a system, a machine designed to select, weaken, and consume those least likely to be defended, the poor, the orphaned, the forgotten. Paying students remained largely untouched, their suffering moderated, their families present. Charity cases were disposable. Invisible perfect. Fear wrapped itself around Margaret's thoughts like wire. She knew now what awaited those summoned too often. She knew why the dead were buried quickly. Why questions dissolved into silence. Why Victoria never mourned. At night, lying rigid in her narrow bed, Margaret listened to the building breathe. She imagined the third floor above her, the chamber sealed in darkness. The whispers etched into the walls. She imagined the men arriving quietly, cloaked in respectability, stepping into a world where consequence could not follow them, and she understood something even more terrifying. St. Mary's Academy did not exist to educate or redeem, it existed to provide, to offer suffering disguised as salvation, to transform virtue into currency, and everyone who mattered in Salem either benefited from it or chose not to see it. The walls had absorbed too much. The silence had grown too thick, and somewhere within that oppressive quiet, something was waiting. Not justice, not rescue, but revelation. A reckoning that would come far too late for those already claimed, yet would tear the mask from the Academy's face and expose the truth beneath. Until then, the bells would keep ringing. The hymns would keep rising, and the girls would keep disappearing into the shadows, while the town slept peacefully. Convinced that evil could never flourish in a place built on prayer. The nights grew longer, not because of the season, but because of what was done with the hours. Endless evenings were devoted to sessions where Bartholomew Fairfax's voice filled the air, low and relentless. As he read from carefully chosen passages meant not to enlighten but to erode, the girls sat perfectly still, backs straight, hands folded, forbidden to ask, forbidden to react, forbidden even to shift their gaze. Silence was not encouraged. It was enforced. By the time these sessions ended, minds were dulled, bodies drained, and whatever fragile sense of self remained felt dangerously thin. This relentless structure achieved its purpose. Exhaustion replaced resistance. Isolation replaced friendship. Bonds that might have offered comfort were cut before they could form. Any attempt at whispered conversation, any folded scrap of paper passed between trembling fingers was met with swift consequence. Punishments were designed not only to cause pain, but to instill fear so deep it discouraged thought itself. And yet, even under such suffocating control, something unexpected began to grow. Communication did not vanish. It evolved. Glances held a fraction too long. Hands brushed in passing, fingers tapping quiet codes against tabletops. Words slipped into innocent phrases that carried hidden meaning beneath their surface. During supervised chores and lessons, fragments of truth passed silently from girl to girl. Within this fragile network, Margaret Sullivan became a quiet center, not by declaration but by necessity. She had survived longer than most. She remembered those who were gone. And she paid attention. Through this underground exchange, a far darker picture began to emerge. The special instruction sessions were not lessons in faith. They were ordeals. Girls spoke of being given bitter tea that coated the tongue and clouded the mind, leaving them dizzy, heavy, and strangely detached from their own bodies. Time blurred afterward. Memories slipped like water through open hands. Some recalled being dressed in garments that felt wrong, pale and shapeless, clinging to them like burial cloth rather than clothing. Others described ceremonies drenched in candle, smoke, and incense. Prayers spoken in unfamiliar tongues that raised goose flesh along their arms. But it was the men who haunted these accounts most vividly. They were always well-dressed, always composed, men whose voices carried education and authority, whose manners reflected wealth and refinement. yet their eyes betrayed them. There was a hunger there, sharp and calculating, that made the girls instinctively recoil. These men sat along the edges of the chambers, watching, judging, sometimes joining in the rituals, always with the assurance of those who knew they would never be questioned. They were not guests. They were expected. As winter loosened its grip and spring crept hesitantly into Salem, Margaret understood the truth with terrifying clarity. This was not misguided faith. This was not excessive discipline. This was something engineered, an institution masquerading as salvation while systematically breaking young women down, spirit first, body next, life last. The realization struck her with a force that stole her breath, yet alongside the terror bloomed something else, resolve. She recognized the signs in herself now. The tremor in her hands, the constant fatigue that sleep could not cure, the way her thoughts sometimes drifted, slipping just out of reach. She had seen this before, in Hannah, in Priscilla, in Mary Catherine. The process had begun, but Margaret Sullivan was not ready to vanish quietly. She had survived hunger, abandonment, years of being invisible. She would not allow herself to be erased without resistance. As the days lengthened and the academy continued its grim rhythm, she began to plan. Every glance, every whispered fragment, every small observation became part of something larger. If escape proved impossible, then exposure would have to suffice. The truth, she decided, would not die with her. The opportunity arrived in an unexpected form. In early autumn, a new presence entered St. Mary's Academy, one that did not fit the established order. Miss Constance Hartwell arrived not as a student, but as an instructor. Her hiring alone marked a departure from the Fairfax family's insular control. She was young, educated, and most dangerously of all, curious. Constance Hartwell had been raised in comfort, the daughter of a successful Boston merchant who had given her an education few women of the era enjoyed. Her studies had taken her to progressive institutions where questions were welcomed and intellect encouraged. She had learned to challenge ideas rather than absorb them unquestioningly. When she accepted the position at St. Mary's, she did so believing she could bring that same enlightenment to girls who had been denied opportunity. The salary was generous. The mission appeared noble. Her father objected, insisting that a woman of her standing should focus on marriage, not employment. But Constance possessed both his determination and his sharp mind. She argued that teaching would strengthen her independence, not diminish it. In the end, she prevailed. From her first days within the academy, unease settled in her thoughts. The students she taught were intelligent, capable, yet curiously subdued. Their responses were precise but lifeless. When she posed questions meant to spark discussion, silence followed. Not confusion, not hesitation. Silence born of fear. Their eyes flicked toward the door, toward the windows, as if expecting punishment for thinking too freely. Constance noticed the rigidity of the schedule, the absence of laughter, the way certain topics caused visible tension. She noticed how some girls flinched at sudden sounds, how others avoided her gaze entirely, and she noticed Margaret. There was something different about her. A guarded awareness, a spark carefully hidden but not extinguished. When their eyes met, something passed between them, fleeting but unmistakable, a recognition, a warning, a plea. Constance Hartwell had arrived believing she was stepping into a place of learning. Instead, she had walked into a carefully maintained illusion. And though she did not yet grasp the full depth of what lurked behind the academy's walls, she sensed it instinctively. The facade was cracking. Victoria Fairfax could not yet see it. But the system she had built depended on absolute control, and control had been breached. One observant teacher, one determined student, one truth waiting to be spoken. The bells still rang, the hymns still echoed, but somewhere beneath the polished floors and sanctified words, the first tremors of reckoning had begun. She was greeted not by curiosity, but by empty stares and voices that recited facts as if pulled from a wound-up mechanism. The answers arrived too quickly, too perfectly, stripped of hesitation or thought, revealing not comprehension but conditioning. What unsettled Constance most was not their ignorance, but their fear. Fear of pausing, fear of wondering aloud, fear of asking the simplest question, as though inquiry itself were a transgression that invited punishment. In every other classroom she had known, young women bloomed when given permission to think. Curiosity came naturally, like breath. Here at St. Mary's Academy, curiosity had been hunted down and smothered. Independent thought had been treated as a disease, carefully excised until only obedience remained. The girls sat rigid, hands folded, eyes lowered, as though their minds had been trained to disappear before their bodies ever would. At first, Constance told herself this was merely the result of severe devotion. She had grown up with scripture woven into every hour of the day, and understood discipline in the name of faith. But as the weeks darkened and autumn settled heavily around the academy, a deeper unease took hold. This was not devotion. This was erasure. The moment her doubt became undeniable arrived quietly, during a mathematics lesson when the chalk paused mid-air. Sarah Peaton, a girl known for her sharp mind, stared at the slate as though it were written in an unfamiliar language. Her fingers shook as she attempted a calculation she should have mastered years before. Numbers slipped from her grasp, vanishing as soon as they formed. When Constance knelt beside her desk and spoke softly, Sarah's reply came in a whisper shaped by terror. She glanced toward the door, then back again, as though walls themselves could listen. She spoke of a heaviness behind her eyes, of thoughts dissolving into fog, of a mind that no longer belonged to her. She repeated the word she had been given, that this confusion was purification, that clarity was sinful, that obedience was holy. But beneath the rehearsed explanation was grief. She remembered being whole before she arrived. From that day on, Constance watched more closely, too closely, and what she saw haunted her. Pale faces drained of color, bodies moving as if weighed down by invisible chains, complaints of pain that returned with ritual regularity. The trembling she had once noticed in Evangeline Fairfax appeared again and again, spreading like a curse passed hand to hand. Despite promises of nourishment and care, the girls grew thinner, weaker, as though something unseen was feeding on them from within. It reminded her of sickness. Not a specific illness, but the look of those poisoned slowly, deliberately. A deterioration that did not rage but whispered. Her unease sharpened when she learned where she was not allowed to go. The third floor was spoken of in hushed reverence, declared sacred, sealed behind polite smiles and rigid rules. When she suggested using one of its rooms for study, Victoria Fairfax's response was immediate and cold. The explanation came wrapped in sanctity, but the eyes that delivered it burned with warning. The third floor was not merely restricted, it was protected. From that moment, Constance understood that the Academy's architecture was a map of secrecy, and secrets move most freely at night. She began to notice patterns others ignored, lights that flickered when no one should be awake, footsteps echoing above after prayers had ended, murmured hymns carried by the wind, warped into something almost unrecognizable. These were not lessons, they were preparations. It was on a night soaked in rain that her path crossed with Margaret Sullivan. Thunder rattled the windows as Constance moved quietly through the corridor when she noticed a pale figure ahead, a student but not dressed for sleep or study. The gown she wore was white, unnaturally so, glowing faintly beneath the oil lamps like a shroud waiting for a body. Constance followed, heart pounding, each step swallowed by the carpet. She watched Margaret press, her ear to the side door, listening with an intensity that suggested fear and urgency in equal measure. Whatever she heard was enough to send her retreating into the shadows. When Margaret turned and saw her, time seemed to stop. They stood frozen, two souls caught in forbidden motion. Both knew the cost of being discovered. In that suspended moment, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, understanding, the shared knowledge that neither belonged to the silence this place demanded. Margaret stepped forward, her eyes burned with resolve sharpened by desperation. Her voice was barely more than breath as she spoke Constance's name, pleading not for comfort but for truth. She asked for a meeting, not here, not now, tomorrow, alone. The next day stretched endlessly. The classroom air felt heavier, the ticking clock louder, every answer spoken by the other girls hollow and rehearsed. When the lesson finally ended and the room emptied, Margaret remained behind, just as promised. What she revealed did not come all at once. It poured out slowly like blood seeping through cloth. She spoke of ceremonies masked as instruction, of bitter tea that dulled the senses, of memories fractured and incomplete, of being dressed in white and led into rooms that smelled of incense and decay. She spoke of men who watched from the edges, their fine clothes unable to hide the hunger in their eyes. Men who prayed and observed and waited. Margaret spoke of girls who entered those rooms and returned changed, and of those who never returned at all. As she spoke, Constance felt the walls closing in, the academy revealing itself not as a place of learning, but as a machine built to break, to drain, to consume. A sanctuary only in name. A trap sanctified by hymns. Somewhere above them, a bell rang, and in that sound Constance understood with terrible clarity that the silence she had mistaken for discipline was the echo of something far worse. Control had been broken, a truth had found its voice, and once spoken, it would not be buried again. The gospel of the haunted had begun to whisper back. What Margaret revealed over the next hour did not arrive as a single blow, but as a slow unraveling that left Constance gasping for breath. Each word peeled away another layer of illusion, until the image of St. Mary's Academy she had carried into that room lay in ruins. By the time Margaret finished speaking, the academy no longer resembled a school at all, but a carefully engineered trap, designed with patience, precision, and utter disregard for human life. Margaret spoke with a strange calm, as though terror had burned itself out long ago and left behind only clarity. She explained the academy's inner workings not as rumor or hysteria, but as a system she had studied in silence. She described how certain girls were selected, how their routines subtly changed, how their health declined in predictable stages. She spoke of nights when carriages arrived without announcement, of men whose names were never recorded, of doors that opened only after prayers had ended and the halls had gone still. The illness was no accident. The weakness was cultivated. Margaret was certain of it. The drinks offered during special instruction dulled the senses and softened resistance. Minds grew slow, memories fragmented, willpower dissolved. By the time the girls were led upstairs, they were already half gone, their spirits loosened from their bodies, their voices trapped behind obedience and fear. Then Margaret said the words that turned dread into something far darker. She did not believe the academy existed to educate or redeem. She believed it was built to supply. The lessons, the hymns, the reputation for charity were nothing more than camouflage, a holy mask worn to hide a marketplace of suffering. The third floor was not sacred ground. It was a place of transaction. She spoke of chambers lit by candles and watched by men who never gave their names, men whose wealth insulated them from consequence, men who arrived as patrons and departed as ghosts, leaving broken bodies and silence behind. The girls were not killed outright. That would have been too obvious. They were dismantled slowly, reduced piece by piece until resistance was impossible and death appeared merciful. Margaret named the dead. She refused to let them remain statistics or whispers. She spoke their names with quiet fury and declared that they had not faded or failed. They had been taken, destroyed with intention, murdered as surely as if blood had stained the floors. Constance listened, her hands clenched tight enough to ache, every instinct screaming that this could not be real. And yet, every detail locked into place with horrifying precision. The trembling, the vacant stares, the secrecy, the reverence afforded to the Fairfax name. It was all too consistent, too carefully maintained to be coincidence. The truth settled over her like a suffocating weight, but truth alone was not enough. Accusations without proof would vanish beneath the academy's reputation. The Fairfax family stood above suspicion, wrapped in sermons and social standing. A teacher with modest means and a charity student with no family would never be believed. Worse, they would be silenced, permanently. They needed evidence, tangible, undeniable proof, and they would have to gather it while pretending to know nothing at all. As winter tightened its grip on Salem, an unspoken war began within the academy's walls. Every smile became a performance, every lesson a disguise. Constance and Margaret moved carefully, knowing that a single misstep would be fatal. They were not the hunters in this game. They were the ones being watched, measured, evaluated. Their alliance was improbable but effective. Constance's education granted her access. Margaret's past had taught her survival. Together they became something dangerous. Constance used the privileges of her position to enter places students never could. She worked late, grading papers in Victoria Fairfax's office, her presence justified by diligence and duty. While she sat at the polished desk, Margaret waited nearby, alert to every footstep. When the opportunity came, the locks yielded easily beneath Margaret's practiced hands. What they found chilled them beyond fear. Hidden beneath orderly correspondence and respectable records were ledgers unlike anything Constance had ever seen. Numbers replaced names. Evaluations measured obedience, deterioration, desirability. Progress was charted not in knowledge gained but in resistance lost. Dosages were adjusted, isolation prescribed. Timelines estimated with cold certainty. Margaret found herself there, reduced to an entry. A subject. Her age, her temperament, her perceived value. Notes described her defiance as an obstacle to be corrected. Her future reduced to a calculation measured in months. The handwriting was calm, professional, almost bored. The ledgers went further. Preferences were listed with casual cruelty. Youth, fragility, fire, submission. Each request noted, each desire accommodated. The girls were not people. They were inventory. Commodities prepared for consumption beneath the veil of prayer. Every page felt like a violation. Every line confirmed that the Academy's true curriculum was suffering. As they copied what they could and returned everything to its place, both women understood that discovery was inevitable. Suspicion was already tightening around them. Eyes lingered too long. Questions were asked with sharpened politeness. The walls themselves seemed to listen. Winter pressed on, and with it came the knowledge that time was running out. The Fairfax family had perfected this operation over years. They would not hesitate to eliminate threats. Constance and Margaret were no longer invisible, yet even as fear coiled tighter, something else grew stronger. Resolve. The truth was no longer a whisper. It was documented, real, and once known, it demanded to be carried into the light, no matter the cost. Somewhere in the Academy, a hymn rose into the cold air. Beneath it, footsteps moved along the 3rd floor. And in the shadows, 2 women prepared to risk everything, knowing that survival was no longer the only goal. Now, there would be reckoning, and the gospel of the haunted would remember their names. What they uncovered next stripped away any lingering doubt, replacing it with a nausea so intense it seemed to crawl beneath the skin. Among the coded ledgers and clinical evaluations were references to girls deemed unsuitable, marked with careful language that pretended mercy while describing erasure. Some were labeled unstable, others were noted as damaged, unresponsive, or simply broken. These euphemisms were not diagnoses, they were death sentences. Yet even this horror paled beside the letters. They lay hidden at the bottom of Victoria Fairfax's desk, bound neatly with ribbon, each page written in a graceful hand that spoke of refinement and confidence. There was no desperation in the ink, no hesitation, only certainty. These were not the writings of a fanatic blinded by belief, but of a woman conducting business with practiced ease. One letter, dated deep into the winter, addressed a man whose full name was never recorded, spoke with chilling clarity. Victoria wrote of progress made, of troublesome traits corrected, expectations soon to be fulfilled. She assured discretion. She referenced payment as casually as one might discuss a charitable donation. The sum mentioned was staggering. The tone was warm, friendly, proud. Reading it, Constance felt something fracture inside her. The Academy's purpose stood naked on the page. This was not corruption hidden beneath chaos. It was an organized system, a pipeline of suffering feeding the appetites of men who would never face consequence. As more documents surfaced, the full scope revealed itself. St. Mary's was a hub, not an isolated aberration. Girls were acquired, conditioned, and distributed. Some were leased for evenings, others were sold entirely, their existence erased with forged records and compliant officials. The methods were precise. Drugs to weaken the body, isolation to erode the mind, scripture twisted into a weapon to dismantle identity itself. Death was not failure, death was management. Those who resisted too fiercely, who sickened too quickly, who threatened exposure, were removed with careful efficiency. Dosages were adjusted until hearts stilled quietly in the night. Dr. Edmund Fairfax ensured the paperwork aligned with respectability. Fevers, nervous disorders, spiritual exhaustion. The language of medicine wrapped murder in legitimacy. While Constance and Margaret worked in stolen moments, copying what they could, a new fear grew heavier with each passing day. They were being watched. Victoria's demeanor shifted subtly, like a predator narrowing its focus. Questions, once polite, grew pointed. Observations lingered longer than comfort allowed. During meetings, Victoria's gaze returned to Constance again and again, weighing her words, measuring her reactions. It was not accusation, it was assessment. By the new year, tension thickened the air. Then another girl died. Elizabeth Morrison had arrived, frail but hopeful, her youth untouched by the deeper horrors of the academy. She had not lingered long enough to fade slowly. One morning, she simply did not wake. No struggle, no warning. Life extinguished as though a candle had been pinched between unseen fingers. Dr. Fairfax declared the cause within minutes. His explanation was rehearsed, delivered with bored authority. Constance felt fury burn behind her eyes. She had taught Elizabeth. She had seen the spark still flickering there. This girl had not been dying. Margaret brought worse news. Elizabeth had been taken upstairs night after night in the days before her death. She had returned shaken, tear-streaked, speaking in half sentences. She had begged to write home. The request had been denied in the name of salvation. That denial sealed Constance's resolve. Documents were no longer enough. The Academy could bury paper. They could discredit testimony, but they could not erase what was witnessed. That night, Constance made her decision. She would see the third floor herself. Margaret fought her, terror sharpening every word. Discovery would mean the end. But Constance understood something Margaret could not yet see. Survival without exposure would only delay the inevitable. The system would continue. Girls would keep disappearing. Silence would win. If the truth was to live, someone had to risk everything. The opportunity arrived with brutal symmetry. A large gathering was scheduled. Multiple clients. Multiple girls. The coded notes spoke of preparation and demand with nauseating calm. Margaret learned she herself had been selected. The plan was madness, but there was no alternative. On the chosen night, the Academy followed its ritual. Doors were locked. Prayers murmured. The building settled into artificial sleep. Earlier unnoticed, Constance slipped onto the forbidden floor and concealed herself inside a narrow storage space. Dust coated her lungs. Darkness pressed close. Through a narrow grate, she waited. Time stretched, elastic and merciless. Footsteps approached. Doors opened. Candles bloomed into flame. Figures entered the chamber, their shadows bending grotesquely along the walls. The girls followed, dressed in pale garments that erased individuality, faces dulled by exhaustion and fear. Men arrived next. Their voices were calm, conversational. They spoke as patrons, not participants, yet their eyes betrayed anticipation. Constance watched, breath shallow, heart hammering as the ceremony began. Words were spoken that twisted faith into submission. Incense burned thick, cloying. A cup was passed from hand to trembling hand, and then she understood, with devastating clarity, that nothing she had imagined was worse than the truth unfolding before her eyes. Somewhere below, a hymn drifted upward, muffled and false. Above it, evil wore civility, and hidden in the walls a witness watched, knowing that once seen, this horror could never be unseen. The reckoning had begun, and the gospel of the haunted would carry what followed into the dark where it belonged. The night demanded absolute precision. Margaret would submit to the ritual as demanded, forcing herself to cling to awareness no matter what foul concoction was pressed to her lips, her mind sharpening itself against the fog so she could remember what Constance might miss. Every detail mattered, every breath, every shadow. The plan balanced on a knife's edge, dependent on timing, silence, and a measure of luck neither woman truly trusted. Constance's greatest danger lay not in the third floor but in being noticed before she ever reached it. Absence was suspicious. Curiosity was fatal. So she manufactured weakness, speaking softly of a pounding head and blurred vision, excusing herself early with the obedient demeanor expected of her. She retreated to her room under the pretense of rest and study, waiting until the Academy settled into its carefully enforced stillness. When the hour came, she slipped into the corridor and found the servants' staircase. Each step protested beneath her weight, the wood groaning like an old throat clearing to scream. She froze again and again, heart lodged in her chest, listening for footsteps, for voices, for the slightest sign that she had already been discovered. None came. only the hollow quiet of a building that had learned how to swallow sound. The forbidden floor greeted her with dim lamps and an air that felt wrong, thick with incense and a sweeter undertone that stirred distant, unpleasant memories of numbness and loss of control. The walls were crowded with religious art, but these were not images of comfort. They depicted agony, surrender, broken bodies sanctified by suffering. Eyes followed her from the canvas, painted mouths frozen mid-prayer or mid-scream. The effect was deliberate. She felt it pressing against her thoughts, urging submission. She reached the storage space she had marked in her mind and eased herself inside. The smell of soap and dust clung to her clothes. A crate waited beneath the ventilation opening like an offering. She climbed carefully, positioning herself so the grate framed the chamber beyond. Then she waited. Voices approached, low, purposeful. The door opened, and Evangeline Fairfax entered bearing porcelain cups that gleamed softly. Her movements were gentle, reverent, as though she carried communion. Bartholomew followed, draped in ceremonial garments that erased the man and left only authority and threat behind. But when Victoria stepped into the room, the air changed. Power bent toward her. She wore deep violet silk etched with unfamiliar symbols that seemed to shift as the light flickered, as if the fabric itself breathed. The chamber no longer resembled any room meant for study or prayer. Candles burned in ornate stands, casting warped shadows across tapestries that told stories no scripture should contain. At the center rose a platform draped in white, surrounded by chairs arranged with ritual precision. Everything had been prepared, every detail controlled. The girls were brought in next. 6 of them, pale, unsteady, wrapped in identical white garments that stripped them of individuality. Margaret walked among them, her face distant, her eyes glassy but alive. Constance forced herself to focus on her, drawing strength from the knowledge that Margaret was still thinking, still watching, even as the drug took hold. Then the men arrived. They entered with the confidence of those who expected obedience from the world. Wealth clung to them like a scent. Constance recognized faces she had seen praised in public halls and church pews, men who shaped laws, men who judged others, men who preached morality. Here, they smiled without shame. What followed unfolded with horrifying order. Words were spoken that twisted faith into justification. Music filled the room, soft and haunting, guiding the rhythm of what came next. The girls were handled, positioned, directed as though they were objects in a ceremony rather than living beings. The men watched, participated, their actions framed as reverence instead of violence. Bartholomew's voice guided the proceedings, measured and commanding, while Evangeline's melodies softened the edges, wrapping cruelty in beauty. Victoria oversaw it all with cold efficiency. She adjusted the pace, corrected missteps, ensured satisfaction. The ritual moved forward as planned, suffering transformed into something the participants could interpret as sacred. Constance felt bile rise in her throat. She bit down on her sleeve to keep from making a sound. Time lost meaning, each moment stretched, unbearable and relentless. Margaret's body swayed, but her eyes flicked once toward the grit, a fleeting acknowledgement that burned itself into Constance's memory. She was still there, still fighting. When it ended, the men departed quietly through the side entrance, their appetites sated, their consciences untroubled. The girls were led away, limp and silent, leaving behind only the echo of footsteps and the smell of extinguished candles. Constance did not move. She remained hidden long after the chamber emptied, her muscles locked, her breath shallow, terror rooting her to the crate. Only when she was certain the floor had returned to its false calm did she climb down and slip back into the darkness. She carried proof now. Not ink on paper, not coded ledgers, but knowledge burned into her mind with brutal clarity. Yet with it came despair. The men she had seen were not anomalies, they were pillars. Their power extended far beyond the academy walls. Exposing this evil would mean confronting a network designed to protect itself at all costs. Judges, lawmakers, clergy. Respectability itself had become a shield. As she crept back towards safety, Constance understood the terrible truth. Survival was no longer the greatest danger. Silence was. Somewhere below, the academy slept, wrapped in prayer and deception. Somewhere above, secrets lingered in the air like smoke. and within the walls 2 women now carried a truth so heavy it threatened to crush them, yet so vital it demanded to be spoken. The gospel of the haunted had seen what was never meant to be seen, and once witnessed, the darkness could no longer pretend it was holy. The truth, once fully revealed, carried a weight that threatened to crush the soul. Constance understood now that the men she had seen in the chamber were not merely clients, but guardians of silence. Men with the power to bury inquiries, to turn witnesses into madmen, to reshape reality itself until lies wore the mask of respectability. Even escape offered no salvation. To speak would be to stand alone against voices the world already trusted. To remain silent would be to become complicit in the slow murder of every girl still trapped behind those walls. As dawn crept across the academy, Constance returned to her chamber with the careful steps of someone already half dead. The choice before her was merciless. Silence promised survival measured in days or weeks, followed by disappearance. Truth promised resistance, followed almost certainly by execution disguised as illness or moral failure. Yet she carried another certainty with her, heavier than fear. If nothing was done, the academy would continue feeding on the young and forgotten, its hunger never satisfied. The hunt had reached its final movement. Suspicion thickened in the corridors like unseen smoke. Eyes lingered longer, doors closed more softly. Even prayers felt sharpened, each amen echoing with threat. Whatever reserves of courage Constance and Margaret possessed would be tested now, because the institution had sensed the fracture in its control. The reckoning announced itself on a bitter February morning. Not with screams or bells, but with paper slid beneath a door. The handwriting was unmistakable. A summons. Victoria Fairfax requested Constance's presence immediately following morning chapel, citing matters of her future within the academy. The words were polite. The intent was lethal. As Constance dressed, her fingers shook despite her efforts to still them. Her thoughts returned again and again to Margaret. Had she been called as well, or had the academy already decided that the child was no longer useful? Chapel that morning felt like theatre performed on the edge of a blade. Victoria stood before the congregation, her voice steady, her posture immaculate, yet the mask faltered in subtle ways. Her grip on the pulpit tightened too often. Her gaze swept the room, repeatedly counting, assessing, measuring value. When Constance found Margaret among the students, dread coiled tight in her chest. The girl's usual sharpness was gone. Her body swayed slightly, her eyes unfocused, her will visibly subdued. When their gazes met, Margaret offered no plea, only acceptance. They had been found. After the final hymn, Constance walked to the office as one walks toward execution, every step echoing with finality. Victoria waited behind her desk, no warmth left to perform. What looked up at Constance was not an educator, but a predator savoring dominance. The invitation to sit came softly, dangerously so. Constance obeyed, her spine rigid, her face schooled into neutrality. She had rehearsed lies. She had prepared explanations. None of it mattered. Victoria opened a folder. Inside lay the death of hope. Sketches of the 3rd floor, transcriptions of coded records, financial tallies, observations, and worst of all, Constance. Her own handwriting copied and preserved like evidence at a trial already decided. Weeks of investigation lay neatly assembled, stripped of secrecy, stripped of power. Shock betrayed her despite herself. Victoria watched with interest. "Did you truly believe," she asked, "that curiosity could flourish unseen in a place built on observation? Every step you took was measured, every question noted. You were never hidden. You were allowed." The truth struck like a blow. If the academy had known from the beginning, then the evidence had not been stolen. It had been offered, left like bait. Victoria explained calmly, almost kindly. Constance had served a purpose. Her probing had revealed vulnerabilities. Her alliance with certain students had identified a spreading infection. Curiosity, resistance, hope. Before Constance could respond, the room darkened. Bartholomew Fairfax entered, his presence filling the space with suffocating inevitability. 2 unfamiliar men followed him inside, their expressions empty, their purpose unmistakable. Doors closed behind them with quiet finality. Victoria rose. The pretense of morality fell away. She spoke now of order, of necessity, of sacrifice in the name of higher design. The academy was not evil, she insisted. It was efficient. It transformed waste into value. It refined what society discarded and redirected it toward those who deserved reward. The girls were not victims, they were resources. Constance felt her resolve harden into something cold and sharp. She spoke then, not to persuade, but to record the truth in her own mind. She named what the academy was. She named what they had done. She spoke Margaret's name aloud. That was the mistake. Victoria's smile vanished. Margaret Sullivan, she replied, had been a disappointment. Intelligent, observant, contagious, the very sort of flaw Constance had helped them identify. The girl would not be wasted. She would be corrected. The men moved closer. Constance understood then that escape was no longer the goal. Survival was secondary. What mattered was what happened next, what she chose to do with the truth while breath still filled her lungs. Somewhere beyond the walls, the town continued its rituals, commerce, prayer, comfort. Inside the academy, the machinery of destruction adjusted its gears, and in that moment, as the trap finally closed, Constance knew that even if she did not leave this room alive, the truth she carried had already begun to rot the foundation of the lie. The gospel of the haunted does not promise salvation. It promises remembrance. And once evil is seen clearly, it is never truly alone again. The room, once a chamber of quiet menace, now vibrated with tension so thick it could almost be felt against the skin. Bartholomew Fairfax stood like a shadow of predation, his voice rolling through the office with satisfaction sharpened to a blade. Margaret Sullivan, they claimed, had revealed everything, every secret, every method, every plan Constance, and she had painstakingly crafted to expose the academy. The words hit Constance like a hammer to the chest, threatening to crush the fragile hope she had clung to. Margaret, the courageous girl who had risked life and liberty to gather evidence, had betrayed them. Yet in Bartholomew's cold, glittering eyes, Constance glimpsed something that made her pause. There was a flicker of complexity there, a suggestion that the surface truth was not the whole story. Victoria Fairfax rose then, gliding across the office with the imperious presence of a queen confronting a pawn. Her gaze fixed on Constance with an intensity that made the young woman shrink involuntarily. The question Victoria posed was simple in words, impossible in consequence. What would become of you, Miss Hartwell? Her father, a prominent merchant, would notice her disappearance. The risk to the family's carefully constructed operation was unacceptable, yet to remain a threat was equally perilous. Then came the third option, uttered with a calm so poisonous that it chilled Constance to her core. Join them, Victoria said. Serve the very machine that had enslaved and destroyed hundreds. Your talents, your intellect, your social connections, all would be harnessed in service to cruelty. Payment, position, prestige, complicity offered life. Refusal promised death, quiet, neat, and disguised as something natural, so the world would mourn without ever suspecting the truth. There was no choice, only illusion. As Constance struggled to process the impossibility of it, the air itself seemed to crack with sudden commotion. Shouts tore through the corridors, doors flung open with authority. Victoria's expression faltered, the mask slipping to reveal genuine alarm. The office door burst inward. Blue uniforms of the Massachusetts State Constabulary filled the doorway, their presence immediate, absolute, unyielding. Leading them was a figure who stole Constance's breath, Margaret Sullivan, alive, fiery, every inch the survivor. Relief mingled with disbelief, sharp and electric. The constable's voice cut through the tension, cold and commanding. Arrested for conspiracy, kidnapping and murder, each word like a hammer striking the vaulted silence of the room. Bartholomew, Victoria, Evangeline, the rough men who had served as enforcers, all were to be taken into custody. Victoria's composure fractured, her protests rising in shrill, vain indignation, but the constables were unmoved. They had sworn testimony, documentation, and eyewitness accounts. Authority for once sided with truth instead of corruption. Margaret approached Constance then. Exhaustion and triumph intertwined in her gaze. "I am sorry I could warn you sooner," she whispered, voice urgent, "but I had to make them believe I was broken. Only then could I slip free and alert the authorities. They thought they controlled me. They were wrong." The audacity of the plan, the calculated risk, left Constance momentarily speechless. Margaret had played her role to perfection, confessing while scheming, appearing compliant while gathering allies in the shadows. Through deception, she had turned the Academy's own assumptions against it. She had escaped, navigated the streets to Salem Constabulary, and armed them with the evidence that would dismantle decades of cruelty. In the hours that followed, the Academy's empire began to collapse with terrifying speed. Constables descended on the institution, seizing the Fairfax family and their enforcers. Prominent clients, judges, legislators, men whose power had seemed untouchable were apprehended, their exploitation laid bare for the first time. The network that had once stretched like an invisible web over New England now unraveled in real time. The meticulous, methodical machine of human suffering had no defense against the law and the courage of those it had sought to destroy. Chains clinked, voices shouted, and the once polished floors of St. Mary. As Academy echoed with the sound of its unraveling, Constance watched, heart-pounding, as the people who had turned religion into ritualized horror were led away, their authority shattered. Margaret, alive and defiant, stood by her side, the green fire of her eyes rekindling the hope that had almost been snuffed out. The Academy would not recover, at least not in its former shape, and for the first time the trapped girls might breathe freely, and yet Constance felt a strange chill linger. Evil, once confronted, is never fully vanquished. The memory of the rituals, the drugged compliance, the cruel smiles of men who treated human life as inventory remained etched into the walls and her mind alike. The gospel of the haunted would carry this story forward, whispering its lessons into the shadows, ensuring that what had happened could never again be dismissed or forgotten. It was not salvation, she realized, it was remembrance. Even as the doors closed behind the Fairfax family, as the constables ushered them toward justice, the echo of countless unspoken horrors pulsed through the Academy. Constance understood that seeing the truth had changed her irrevocably. The shadows that once concealed it now bore witness, and once evil is fully revealed, it never truly retreats. It waits, it lingers, and it teaches those who survive to never mistake silence for safety, nor civility for sanctity. Somewhere, beyond the walls, a hymn still drifted upward, muffled and false. Within the Academy, light struggled against shadow, and amidst the ruins of power and deception, two women, one teacher, one student, stood together carrying a truth so heavy, so irrevocable, that it would haunt the conscience of every listener. The gospel of the haunted had seen what was never meant to be seen, and once witnessed that darkness could never pretend to be holy again. The air in Salem smelled faintly of smoke and rain as the investigators moved through the now silent halls of St. Mary's Academy. The echoes of the past lingered in every creaking floorboard, in every darkened corner where shadows had once whispered secrets no one dared speak aloud. Outside the Academy, the powerful men who had relied on its twisted operations discovered that their influence could not protect them from the consequences of their actions. Their names surfaced in the ledgers, in letters written in elegant script, in the meticulous notes of Margaret and Constance, and now in the observations of a woman long dismissed by polite society, Mrs. Abigail Thornton, the seamstress whose cautious vigilance had once been ignored, emerged as the unlikeliest of witnesses, her working-class eyes seeing truths that the elite preferred to ignore. She had documented for years the strange lights, the midnight visitors, the steady deterioration of the girls entrusted to the Fairfax family, her journal a chronicle of creeping horror. Her testimony fused with that of the two women, forming a lattice of evidence that could not be shattered by wealth or social standing. What had begun as accusations, fragile and easy to dismiss, became a tapestry of undeniable proof. The Academy was a machine of human suffering, precise, methodical, and merciless. The trial that followed consumed Massachusetts, riveting the public with a story that felt too monstrous to be true, yet horrifyingly real. Day after day, witnesses recounted the ordeals of the girls, each account corroborated by ledgers and letters, each narrative confirming the unimaginable. Investigators took months to piece together the full extent of the operation. Nearly 3 years of clandestine exploitation came into focus. 43 young women had been extinguished under the guise of natural illness, their bodies silenced by systematic poisoning designed to remove witnesses and maintain secrecy. The meticulous cruelty that had haunted Constance and Margaret's nights was now etched into the record of the Commonwealth. As the courtroom filled with spectators, the scope of the Fairfaxes' crimes was laid bare. stretching far beyond the academy walls, touching judges, legislators, and merchants who had imagined themselves untouchable. Victoria Fairfax, ever composed, attempted to paint herself as a victim, manipulated by men stronger and more cunning than she, but the evidence she had compiled herself betrayed her. Every ledger, every letter, every coded note revealed a mind not only aware of the atrocities but orchestrating them with chilling precision. Bartholomew Fairfax attempted the defense of religious misinterpretation, claiming the rituals were misunderstood ceremonies, but investigators revealed those rites had no precedent in any recognized doctrine. They had been invented solely to cloak systematic abuse in the semblance of piety. Evangeline Fairfax was revealed as a tragic figure, her years of conditioning and chronic drugging stripping her of free will, leaving her an unwilling participant in the horrors that had been orchestrated around her. Her angelic musical performances, which had once filled the chamber with deceptive beauty, were merely instruments of manipulation, echoes of a mind subdued by fear and chemicals rather than choice. The examination of her condition revealed the human cost of the family's methods, a living testament to how innocence could be twisted into complicity. The network of clients faced justice unevenly, some shielded by connections, others toppled by exposure. The scandal forced the resignation and exile of those who thought themselves untouchable. Dr. Edmund Fairfax, whose falsification of death certificates had cloaked murder in legality, received a lengthy prison sentence, ending not only his career but sending tremors through the medical establishment. Finally, Victoria and Bartholomew were sentenced to death, their punishment marking a grim milestone. Victoria Fairfax became the first woman in Massachusetts executed for crimes outside the realm of witchcraft. The scaffold, a stark reminder of the consequences of hidden evil, finally brought to light. Margaret Sullivan, whose courage had ignited the chain of revelations, emerged as a symbol of defiance against corruption. Her bravery and ingenuity inspired reformers and educators alike. She founded her own academy in Boston, one devoted to free, thoughtful education for orphaned and disadvantaged girls, a stark contrast to the horrors of St. Mary's. For more than 3 decades, she nurtured young women into independence, intelligence, and moral courage, producing a generation capable of changing the world in ways that the Fairfaxes never could. Constance Hartwell returned to Boston, her spirit tempered by the darkness she had witnessed but unbroken. She married, raising a family with the knowledge that courage and integrity could triumph, even against machinery of cruelty so elaborate it seemed invincible. Yet neither woman would ever forget the academy. As shadows, the faces of the girls who had suffered, or the lessons of vigilance that horror had taught them. The memory of St. Mary's Academy endured, a cautionary tale inscribed in the conscience of a city, a state, and a nation, and carried forward in whispers by the gospel of the haunted. In the ruins of power, deception, and fear, the truth remained. It had been seen, documented, and remembered. Evil, once fully revealed, could no longer hide behind respectability or wealth, and as Margaret and Constance moved forward into their lives, they carried with them the weight of knowledge that the darkness they had faced would never again pretend to be holy. It would linger in the shadows of empty halls, in the quiet moments of reflection, a reminder that the human heart is capable of both unimaginable cruelty and extraordinary courage. The gospel of the haunted had recorded it all, a record for eternity. Once the darkness is truly witnessed, it can never be unseen, and its lessons will echo through every whisper of the past, present, and future. Constance Hartwell dedicated the remainder of her life to ensuring that the horrors of St. Mary's Academy would never repeat. She became a relentless advocate for oversight and accountability, fighting for systems that could detect abuse before it festered in silence, before darkness could hide behind the guise of virtue. The academy itself, once a place of whispered torment and concealed cruelty, was demolished in 1815. Its stones, once witness to suffering, were sold to help compensate the families of the victims, yet the ground remained haunted. For over 2 decades, the site lay empty, until it was transformed into a public park, a quiet memorial to the 43 young women whose lives had been stolen. A simple monument stands there still, its inscription chilling in its honesty. They were forgotten by the world but not by history. The scandal of St. Mary's Academy rippled far beyond its walls. Massachusetts became the first state to enforce regular inspections of schools, particularly those serving children most vulnerable to exploitation. Every institution was required to maintain meticulous records, now subject to official scrutiny. And gradually, these reforms spread to other states, forming the bedrock of modern educational oversight. Yet the most profound legacy of the case was not legal or procedural, it was the precedent. The convictions demonstrated that no amount of wealth, social prestige, or religious authority could shield criminals when credible evidence and fearless witnesses exposed the truth. The Fairfax family, once untouchable, fell under the weight of their own sins. The story of St. Mary's Academy is a cautionary tale that continues to resonate. It exposes the terrifying ease with which institutions meant to protect the innocent can be turned into instruments of cruelty. It reminds us that evil often hides behind masks of respectability, that the rituals of learning or piety can cloak corruption, and that the courage to speak, to act, to stand together remains the most potent weapon against oppression. Margaret Sullivan's words from the trial echo across the centuries. They thought we were powerless because we were poor, because we were young, because we were alone. They believed they could use us and discard us without consequence, but they forgot that even the powerless find power when they stand together for truth. 2 centuries later, the questions her testimony raised remain hauntingly relevant. How easily might such systematic exploitation recur, hidden beneath the polish of authority, the solemnity of faith, the promise of education? How many institutions might conceal horrors behind the veneer of virtue, waiting for the complacent or the fearful to look away? And yet, the story also offers hope. It shows that vigilance, courage, and moral clarity can dismantle even the most carefully constructed empires of cruelty, that the voices of the vulnerable, amplified and believed, can topple those who prey upon them. The girls of St. Mary. At Academy, Hannah, Priscilla, Mary Catherine, Elizabeth, and the others were silenced in life, but in memory they speak still. Their suffering, preserved in testimony, ledger entries, and the brave words of survivors reaches across the years, urging us not only to remember but to act. Their message is simple, yet eternal. Do not allow evil to masquerade as virtue. Protect the vulnerable. Speak truth to power no matter the cost. Their lives, though stolen, became a beacon for justice and accountability. In honoring their memory, we recognize our own responsibility. We acknowledge that the shadows of St. Mary as Academy are not confined to the past. They are warnings for the present, challenges for the future. We are called to question, to observe, to intervene wherever power meets vulnerability. The gospel of the haunted has preserved their story, a testament that darkness, once revealed, can never hide again. It lingers in the spaces we ignore, in the corners of institutions, in the quiet moments when conscience is tested. And it reminds us, the price of ignoring evil is always greater than the cost of confronting it. Remember them. Remember their names, learn from their sacrifice, and let the shadows of St. Mary as Academy speak through you, through vigilance, courage, and the relentless pursuit of truth.